It's forbidden. A place filled with mysteries. A legendary hunting ground, a refuge for escaped slaves. Holder of military and environmental secrets. A ghost town.
It was some of the saddest days you ever could imagine.
I felt like I was saving lives.
It's a nice story.
Nestled in southeastern Indiana, made up of parts of Jefferson, Ripley, and Jennings counties, these 55,000 acres have been called at times Jefferson Proving Ground, Big Oak's National Wildlife Refuge, home. Putting down roots here meant having them yanked out as the U.S. government displaced one population after another, leaving a no man's land, yet also a national treasure. Large tracts of this land will never be open to the public again, yet people risk their lives each year to try to enter. Louis Munier was born on a farm here, as was his father. 4 generations of his family called this farm home.
My great-grandfather bought this from Nathan Yost in 1853, and my grandfather was here when Morgan's raid went through, and they took 2 horses from my grandfather.
Today, the Munier farmhouse is one of the few structures that's still standing, somewhat.
My brother and I's room was clear in the back on this stone part.
The farms here had been carved out of thick forest wilderness. Backbreaking work by generations had turned what once was considered impenetrable woods into subsistence farms. Families also fished and hunted and relied on neighbors to get by.
We had to work hard on the farm, but everybody did. Seemed like a good life back then.
It's kind of sad in a way to see what's left.
Really, we had beautiful farms.
Norma Irwin was also born here. The creeks and fields, her childhood playground.
Sometimes you think if it doesn't have big flat fields of corn and beans and wheat and things that it's probably not very productive, but that's not true because they all had cattle. Everybody had cattle. Some had beef cattle, some had just milk cows. But you know, back then you made your own butter and you made your own cottage cheese, and that was just the way we lived, and it was wonderful.
When she was a young child, Irwin's father sold their farm and went to work at Old Timbers Lodge, the finest residence in the area. The hunting lodge built by the Alexander Thompson family in 1930 is still legendary, so special it was one of the only buildings allowed to survive to today. It's truly one with the land on which it stands. All of the stone for its thick walls and staircases was quarried locally. The thick old timbers were salvaged from barns of surrounding farms. Its many doors all tell a story, each hinge unique and individually crafted by students at Berea College in Kentucky. It had once been a lively place, full of children, parties, and life, a house surrounded by wildflowers and full of guests. Being allowed back to see the place that she so cherished as a child is a rare treat for Norma Irwin.
Here's where the people that came to play for the parties would sit, and it was usually a banjo and a mandolin and violins. And then they have a huge Christmas tree here. I mean, it went to the ceiling, and it was decorated very pretty. And then when the lights were turned low, they had dances. And they had round dances, they had square dances.
For others in the community, dances and parties were held at the local church or school. The only other property left intact in its original position is Oakdale School, built in 1869. It survives as one of the only one-room schoolhouses left in southern Indiana. Graduate Zella Jones-Matthews attended all 8 grades.
That was our social activity. Come Easter time, we had an egg boiling, put a big iron kettle out there over a bonfire. We'd boil eggs, but we would have ice cream socials there. And all the people, the neighbors would come in and they socialized in that fashion because they knew each other. All farmers helped each other. Come threshing time or fill silo time, everybody worked together and from one farm to the next and on. And it got everybody's work done with all the help between them.
Small schools and churches dotted the countryside, each built as a labor of love by families and parishioners accustomed to working together. The buildings often began as small log structures. In time, the farm families would build more substantial buildings with local creek rock and stone. Otter Creek Baptist, formed in 1848, Liberty Christian, 1818. Monroe Presbyterian Church, formed in 1839 because of its strong abolitionist stance. Big Creek Church was also anti-slavery. Cells and safe houses for escaping slaves abounded in the deep woods, caves, and scattered farms. Among the churches here, St. Magdalene's Catholic Church, for 110 years, served the large settlement of German Catholics in the community. Marilyn Browning attended as a little girl.
The statues, the stations, the pews, and the Mass was in Latin. Beautiful. I still get sentimental.
Little did parishioners know that one day their beloved church in the heart of Indiana would be bombed to pieces, a homeland casualty of World War II.
Perhaps some died of heartbreak. You know, a couple of people that was older felt like they maybe have died of heartbreak.
One time they were doing some thrashing at one of the neighbors' homes, and they noticed that there were so many low-flying airplanes flying low all over the sky right in the area, and they wondered what was going on.
In 1941, the U.S. government announced its decision to construct a 55,000-acre military testing facility. Residents were given only 30 days to abandon their businesses, homes, farms, schools, churches. 30 days and their communities would be gone. Their way of life changed forever. Norma Irwin remembers when her father brought her the news.
He said, "Dolly, we're going to have to move." Then he began to tell me what it involved. It meant all of our neighbors, all of our parents and their families, and that was what was really, I couldn't quite figure it out.
All their neighbors and everybody had to get up and move, and they didn't have much time to console each other because everybody was busy with what they would do themselves.
The government chose this spot for what would become Jefferson Proving Ground because of its strategic value. In order to test munitions, the Army needed a south to north stretch of relatively flat land. South to north was important because if they fired the weapons east or west, the Earth's rotation could throw off their calculations. This spot was centrally located. 80% of the U.S. manufacturing plants were within 350 miles. So they wouldn't have to waste time or take chances with long-range shipment of ammunition. But the Army was also looking for some place that was uninhabited. Mike Moore was a mathematician at the Proving Ground. Now he's its unofficial historian.
If you were used to Washington, D.C., and you came out here and saw all this land, and there's so many trees out here that you would think there wasn't anybody. I mean, there could be a community right here, and if you were a mile away, you'd think you're in the middle of nowhere.
The government marked down the tract as virtually uninhabited, then proceeded to evict 2,000 residents, 500 farms, 8 churches, 5 schools. The entire community of Marble Corner was forced to leave. Today, there's no sense that a major community once stood here.
There were 2,000 people out here, and they were happy here. They just come through the Depression, and one person told me that he didn't know there was a Depression on because everybody was the same.
We had 222 acres that the government got. I don't think they cared anything about people's life. They just wanted to take it, and that was it.
A lot of people just left their belongings, some antiques and whatever, because nobody wanted to buy it, and they didn't have time to do anything decent about getting rid of some nice things.
Long-planned events had to be changed quickly.
I was planning to get married on January that year. I wanted to get married in my father's house that he had built and had a stairway coming down, and I thought, now I'll get my wedding gown and a long train, and I'll have like one of these pictures you see on television. Army said you had to be out by the 1st of January. So I moved my wedding up to the 21st of December.
The government bought people's farms, and while government agents paid what they deemed fair market value for homes, there was no compensation for loss of community, or the emotional attachment to a farm that had been passed down and improved upon by each generation. Do you think your family got a fair deal for the farm?
Well, that's probably about like everybody else. We didn't think we got much.
Why not try to get more?
Well, we didn't think we could.
They heard of the prices they did, my mother and father did, that paying for the farm, they were not figured they didn't have to pay so much because it was poor farmland. But they had many chicken houses on the place, a long hen house and a long brooder house, which had an expensive heating system and hover for the little baby chicks and such. So they could see they were not going to make out enough money to buy another place. So they decided to go down to Madison and talk to the people beforehand, before they were offered.
Matthew's father did convince the government to give them more money, enough to buy a new farm. The family moved some of the smaller chicken houses to the new property, but weren't able to move that year's 20,000 chickens. They lost a year's worth of income. Yet other families found themselves in a tighter spot. Norma Irwin's folks had sold their farm to work and live at Old Timbers. Now, both home and livelihood were taken away.
The people that didn't really own property at that time, they were only paid, I think it was $150 to move. That's all they got. Now today that sounds terrible. And then it was terrible too, because $150, what could you buy? What could you do?
Making matters worse, it was difficult to even find a place to purchase.
Then the prices started going up, you know. So they ran into that too. People wanted a better price than what they might have gotten before.
A lot of people was trying to find a place all at once.
Suddenly, communities that had been as close as family were ripped apart. Churches and schools that had been the social centers for generations would no longer exist. The congregations and classes would be scattered.
Our church was destroyed, and I remember going to the last service they had, and I can remember them singing the last song, "God be with you till we meet again." There was a big crowd, and we were glad to be there with everybody, but it was sad.
Now some stairs or bits of foundation mark the spots where 8 churches once stood. A cross marks St. Magdalene's. One church, Liberty Christian, was purchased by its members, and the entire structure moved outside the boundary. The others were lost, their members and memories scattered.
Our cemeteries were also moved, and I remember my mother crying buckets of tears when they moved the cemetery, because, you know, you wonder how much was moved.
Did you have relatives?
Oh yes, my grandparents. My grandparents were buried there, and my aunt and her husband and a son of theirs are all buried there.
Today, graveside plantings of flowers fill in the depressions of earth left behind. The government paid for the body removal and the new cemeteries. Often the plots were meticulously studied, then the graves arranged in the new cemetery exactly as they had been in the original. Because of complaints and questions about just what was being moved where, the community and Army set up boards to oversee the reinterment.
A lot of times they just dug up a spade full of dirt, put it in a wagon, and called that.
Oh, they didn't really.
Yeah, because it was, when you're buried in a pine box, there's not much left of you after a while. Now, they found buttons and stuff and teeth, and you know, if you listen to them, it's awful. It wouldn't have been right. Sometimes you just have a different color earth, as it was the only sign that there was a burial there. So it would have been a very tough job. I don't know if I'd wanted to have been on that or not.
This wasn't the first time a community had been forced out of here by the government. At the turn of the 19th century, the region had been almost entirely Indian country. But through a series of treaties, the native peoples who also had lived off hunting and fishing these woods were forced to leave. The Native Americans had no choice. The government had need for settlement land and found ways to take it. And 140 years later, those settlers' descendants would have no choice.
This one fellow that lived close to us, his grandfather, his great-grandfather homesteaded that out there, and the deed was on a sheepskin. Told him he could keep that for forever, so he was gonna sue the government, and they told him he couldn't.
So what ended up happening to him?
Well, he moved too.
An article in the January 1941 edition of The Farmer's Guide by Charles E. Hughes describes the mood.
Grim, silent men plod through their chores. Bewildered, tearful women putter about their houses. Not many knew where or exactly when they would be going, but the realization came only too poignantly that things might never be the same again.
I've thought back so many times about my parents because I know how difficult it was for them. Everything we did was hard. It was not like you pick up and move from a community and you leave your graves there and you leave your church there and you can go back. And I think that's the reason this place is so important to me. It's the only thing left standing.
But on the other hand, they had 3,000 jobs here, 3,000 people working here. And Lodge Hardware in Madison got the contract to provide lumber, posts, wire. The chain link fence that goes around it, they got it. So they made killing off of it.
Building Jefferson Proving Ground required constructing an airport, laying railroad tracks, and 64 miles of new roads. By May 10, 1941, only 5 months after the residents had left, General Levin Campbell fired the first test round. By Christmas 1941, most of the construction was complete, just in time for the U.S. to enter the war. From 1941 to 1945, a constant thunder echoed over the land from the testing. The Proving Ground mission involved the final ballistic testing of all types of munitions. Basically, it was the last quality assurance test before the ammunition was sent to the field. At first, they merely measured the velocity and the pressure. Did it fire correctly and land appropriately downrange? But over the years, as technology improved, the tests became highly technical. They found that from the time a round is fired to when it leaves the muzzle of a weapon, there's a lot to be measured. Pressure waves inside the weapon, projectile rotation speed, time, tilt, flight pattern. And any little deviation can be deadly. Bob Hudson was the highest-ranking civilian at the Proving Ground.
These pressure waves bounce back and forth throughout that burning process. In fact, if they get too severe, they can blow the weapon right up on spot, kill the crew, kill everybody.
After the shells were fired, observers would go collect them for technicians to inspect, calibrate, and photograph. During its history, JPG tested the entire Army inventory of conventional ammunition.
The stories that I've heard and read about during the wars of World War II and Korea, the effectiveness of the U.S. munitions versus the Germans and the Japanese both was far superior to them in terms of reliability and functionability. And one of those reasons was, well, of course, we have good manufacturing processes in the United States, but also a testing processes to eliminate and weed out defective stuff.
Many people whose families were moved off the Proving Ground later found work there, like Zella Matthews, who came home to work as a nurse while her husband fought overseas. She found her family's house had been moved to the Circle, along with other farmhouses from the region that were now being used as living quarters for military personnel.
That dormer window upstairs with the 4 windows, it was where my sister and myself, that was our room.
Was it strange seeing the transformation in this place from how you had grown up, the farmland where you had grown up, to this big testing
Yes.
facility? What was that like for you?
I'd like to go back to our farmland and walk through it, but they say it's what they call too hot. There's too much unexploded artillery out there.
In 1942, women made up half the civilian workforce, and throughout the years, JPG continued to provide opportunities for women. In 1962, Marilyn Browning joined on. She eventually became one of the first 2 women to work on the firing line.
In this vicinity, I couldn't nowhere gain the same wages. It gave me great opportunity. You know, the freedom to be outdoors, the freedom to do something I really enjoy and be paid for it.
Yet many people wouldn't envy Browning's work environment. Bomb-proofs, small concrete shelters reinforced with piles of dirt. They were cramped and dark. And even back then, the native animals liked to make these shelters home. So Browning used to bargain with a co-worker.
She said, I'll go in first, and if there's no mice